There is something historians will record from this specific week in April 2026, and it is not the missiles, not the sanctions, and not even the ceasefire itself. What gets written down is the moment when both sides of the most consequential geopolitical standoff since the Cold War chose independently not to show up. Iran did not travel to Islamabad for negotiations, and the United States Congress packed up and adjourned until Tuesday, April 14th, with morning hour at noon and legislative business beginning at 2 p.m., which happens to be the official congressional schedule for a week when a war is being conducted. A ceasefire is collapsing, and the Strait of Hormuz sits under the control of a country openly refusing to return to the table unless its own terms are honored first. That is where we are right now. If you're learning something here, please hit subscribe. Let's get into the video. What Iran did in presenting those 10 points was strategically calculated in a way that rewards careful reading and understanding. It requires setting aside how you feel about Iran because the mechanics of the trap function regardless of your politics. The 10 points arrive publicly, formally translated, and structured as a negotiating framework. And the points themselves were what Iran's own critics described as maximalist, meaning the full capitulation document they had always wanted from Washington. Here is what those 10 points actually said. The United States removes all military forces from every base in the Middle East. The United States and its allies, including Israel, agree to never attack Iran or its proxy forces again. All primary and secondary sanctions get lifted. All frozen Iranian overseas assets get returned. The United States pays war reparations to Iran. Iran takes control of the Strait of Hormuz and charges every transiting ship for $2 million. And on the question of nuclear enrichment, the document offered deliberate, calculated silence. The trap built into that structure had no clean exit. If Washington accepted those terms, Iran collected its victory without firing another missile. And if Washington refused, the negotiations collapsed while Iran already held the choke point. What nobody expected was that the President of the United States would post on social media, calling those exact 10 points, in his own words, a workable basis on which to negotiate, going further by reposting the Iranian foreign minister directly on his own account with his own endorsement attached. That single post traveled to every government from Riyadh to Tokyo to every back channel where an ally was already reconsidering what an American security guarantee still meant, and the damage landed without a single additional missile being launched. A previous Ayatollah could only have dreamed of extracting that kind of acknowledgement from Washington. What a leader says publicly and what he tells his cabinet privately are two separate intelligence signals, and right now both are available for analysis. Publicly, the president declares that oil will flow again, that the Strait of Hormuz is open, that America is strong, and that the ships are loaded with the best weapons ever made. Privately reporting from inside the White House from people in that building and in that cabinet tells a different story. One where he does not believe Iran will surrender control of the strait, where he doubts the waterway reopens quickly, and where genuine worry sits behind the confident public statements. The gap between those two positions is one of the most dangerous conditions in geopolitics, not only because it signals weakness to the other side, but because the other side can read that gap in the behavior in the negotiating positions that keep shifting and in the decision to announce a 2-way ceasefire against a backdrop of 10 points that any closure reader knew were completely asymmetric from the start. Iran read exactly that gap, and their response came back clinical and precise. They announced they would not travel to Islamabad until Washington honored the framework it had already endorsed. No missile, no military action, just a diplomatic hold, and it worked. The choice of Pakistan as mediator tells you something specific about how this administration constructed its approach to these negotiations. Pakistan's Defense Minister Khawaja Asif reposted a message publicly this week stating that Israel must be restrained for the U.S.-Iran ceasefire to hold, which means the man Washington selected to sit in the middle of this negotiation was publicly identifying Washington's closest regional ally as the obstacle to peace. That is the chosen mediator, and the architecture of that choice carries weight. Pakistan holds its own complex relationships with China, with India, with the broader Islamic world, and with serious domestic pressures, none of which align cleanly with American objectives in the region. What makes this harder to ignore is that Israel announced no ceasefire existed with Lebanon. And Lebanese civilians paid the price for that clarity this week, with over 258 people killed and more than 1,000 casualties in a single operation conducted during what Washington was describing as a ceasefire period. When the mediator says your ally must be restrained and that ally is simultaneously running operations of that scale, what you have is not a ceasefire but a temporary pause in selected categories of violence while the underlying conditions remain completely unresolved. A delay dressed up as a deal. Article 1 of the United States Constitution assigns the power to declare war to Congress, not to the president. And the founders designed it that way because they had watched what unchecked executive war-making produced in the monarchies they had just separated from. Here is what we're hearing from Congress right now. Republican members are going on television to argue that the legislature should not micromanage a war, that 535 members cannot function as co-CEOs of a military conflict, and that the president should be left to handle it without interference from the Hill. That is not a defense of executive competence. That is an abdication of constitutional responsibility wrapped in the language of pragmatism, and the House then adjourned to underline the point. Structural analysis requires being clear about what follows. When the body constitutionally empowered to declare and oversee war removes itself from the room, the war does not pause alongside it. It continues without correction mechanisms, and errors made in that condition tend to build on each other rather than resolve. The compounding is already visible and is happening in real time. The piece that most commentary is missing right now is also the piece that will carry the most weight 5 years from now. Every Arab government from Saudi Arabia to the UAE to Jordan to Egypt constructed its security architecture on a single operating assumption that the American security umbrella was real, that American military presence, diplomatic weight, and financial leverage added up to a genuine guarantee, and that accepting American preferences on oil production, military procurement, and diplomatic alignment was a reasonable price for that protection. That arrangement never appeared in any formal treaty, but it functioned as the operating system of regional security for 50 years. Now those same governments are watching a ceasefire in which Iran received implicit control of the Strait of Hormuz, watching an American president publicly endorse terms that include the removal of all American military bases from the region, and watching the negotiating baseline shift to a document that Washington itself would have vetoed at the United Nations 2 years ago. The question being asked quietly in those capitals is whether the American security guarantee still means anything, and if the answer tilts toward no, whether they need to build their own deterrent capability. That question circulating through enough capitals at the same time is how regional arms races begin, how proxy conflicts harden into direct ones, and how a Middle East that was slowly moving towards stabilization through the Abraham Accords and normalization tracks snaps back into a pre-1973 logic where every state calculates survival on its own terms. What we are watching right now will be recorded as the first instance in American history of a president starting a war and losing it by himself without suffering a conventional military defeat on the battlefield. And that distinction matters because it describes a new and harder to explain category of strategic failure. The hardware is still there, the carriers are still in position, and the bases technically remain operational. But the strategic outcome has already shifted. Iran controls the choke point. The Iranian framework now anchors the negotiations. Iranian terms set the baseline for any future agreement, and the rest of the world is calling Tehran, not Washington, to understand what just happened. That shift arrived not through military failure, but through diplomatic collapse, negotiating incoherence, and the inability to distinguish between a social media post and a binding geopolitical commitment. The post-World War II structure, the Pax Americana, the security guarantees, the dollar-anchored trade system, the assumption that American power formed the floor under the global order. None of that is ending because of a battlefield defeat. It is ending because of something harder to communicate to a domestic audience, but immediately legible to every foreign government watching, which is that the guarantor of the entire system stopped showing up. Criticism without a structural alternative is just commentary. So let me lay out what coherent strategy in this region actually requires. The first move is reinforcing the Abraham Accords with a genuine air defense architecture that ties Gulf states to Israel and to each other, creating interlocking deterrence that no longer depends entirely on American presence to hold together. The second move is serious investment in the India-Middle East economic corridor. The ports and pipelines that connect the Gulf to Europe directly and bypass the Strait of Hormuz, which reduces the leverage value of that choke point over time through infrastructure rather than military force. The third move is strengthening NATO and tying it more explicitly to the Abraham Accords framework, which builds what amounts to an arc of allied deterrence running from Ukraine through the eastern Mediterranean and into the Gulf, a structure that holds against both Russian pressure from the north and Iranian pressure from the south. Alongside all of that, Congress needs to return to war and peace decisions not as a micromanagement body, but as the constitutionally designated authority it was always designed to be. With a 2/3 Senate vote required for any agreement that trades American military presence for Iranian restraint and a war powers resolution that reestablishes the principle that restructuring the entire global security order is not a decision one person makes alone. That is not a partisan position. That is what the constitutional design was built to prevent. Empires rarely collapse in a single battle. They collapse in the accumulating distance between what they say and what they do, between public confidence and private worry, between constitutional obligation and convenient absence. This week, Congress went home while a war ran without oversight. Iran declined to travel to Islamabad while the ceasefire it nominally accepted continued to collapse, and the Arab world took careful notes about everything it witnessed. A document that no American president should ever have endorsed became the working baseline for whatever negotiation comes next in one of the most strategically consequential regions on the planet. And that transition happened not with a dramatic announcement, but with a social media post that passed largely unremarked in the domestic news cycle. Historians will not write primarily about the missiles or the fire. They will write about the quiet week when both sides of a world-defining confrontation looked at the negotiating room and found it empty. And they will record carefully what that absence cost. Stay with me because this story has a long way left to run. This is the video today. See you later.